Yes.
I've got some pictures that are pretty important to see, I think. They're probably more important than what I had to say for part of this. So I'm the extension wildlife specialist. Talk to a lot of crowds like y'all about how to manage predators. A little different kind of topic than thinking about grass weeds and stuff like that, but still an important one. Lots of older faces in here, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but many of you may remember Charlie Lee or Bob Henderson, and I'm the new Bob and Charlie, so I fill the roles that those guys did for years. See if I can make this thing work. Well, the clicker doesn't want to work, that's no good. All right, I'll just punch through these. So just a real quick outline so you don't think all I'm gonna do is talk about graphs and statistics. We're gonna start off talking about how many critters die of different causes. Then we'll talk about how to go about the process of trying to figure out what killed something. Once we know if it's been scavenged on or killed by a predator, then how do we ID the predator that's responsible? And then we'll go into how to prevent predation, and then also how to control predators when that's something that we need to do. So in the U.S., and this is according to the most recent statistics that the USDA collects, some of y'all may have received a survey or may sometimes get a survey from the USDA about losses and those sorts of things, and that's where these data come from. So 11% of calf losses in the U.S. in an average year are due to predators. In Kansas, we do quite a bit better than that. It's down around 5%. So it's not a huge percentage of our calf loss. Coyotes are responsible for most of the predation events that are on calves in Kansas. What predator do you suppose is responsible for the next month?
Pigs.
Pigs?
Eagles.
No. Oh, eagles. You know, out in this country, you probably have more eagle predation than we see in other parts of the state. They are not a major contributor to losses of calves in the U.S. or of Kansas at this point.
Rattlesnake.
Nope. I'll give you a hint. I've got one sleeping out in my pickup right now.
Dogs.
Yeah.
Wild town dogs.
Yeah, well, it doesn't have to be a town dog. Sometimes it's the neighbor's guard dog. And I deal with a lot of those. And even though it's only about 5% of the losses are due to predators in Kansas every year, it's about $4 million annually lost by producers. So it's still a big chunk of money. It's still very, very important. Any sheep producers in here? Any goat producers in here? No. So you probably don't care about these, but we'll still talk about them anyway. Because coyotes are a smaller animal, sheep, and because sheep are a smaller animal, a much greater percentage of the losses of those animals every year are due to predators. And they're much more vulnerable for a much longer period of their life. So 30% of adult sheep losses on an average year are due to predators, and about 40% of lamb losses are due to predators. Kansas is very similar to those national trends. One of the interesting things that we see with sheep producers is versus cattle producers, so I don't have this statistic up there, but it's about 5% of cattle producers every year report a loss to predators, or multiple losses to predators. Well, we have 40% of the lamb losses are due to predators, but only 15% of sheep operations report losses to predators. What's that say to you?
Probably more.
More? What do you mean?
More actually were killed than what you know of.
Okay, there may have been more than they know of, so some of those 15, there may be a difference here of people not realizing they had losses, is what you're saying?
Oh, I was thinking only 15% of the operations actually reported.
They only reported having losses. So we're still surveying that same group, right? It's all one survey.
I got you.
This tells me that you don't have to have losses of sheep. If we use the right husbandry practices and do things in a certain way, Many sheep and goat producers don't lose animals to coyotes or other predators. And so that helps me do my job in terms of helping people with these challenges. Coyotes are the main predator responsible for lamb losses and sheep losses. This number fluctuates annually. It'll bounce around, but coyotes are still the most important predator of these animals. Dogs are another important predator. And then here's that one that the gentleman in front mentioned, eagles. That's starting to be a problem for sheep producers and sheep producers in Kansas as well. And part of that is bald eagles around reservoirs in eastern Kansas, and part of that is probably some golden eagles out here and some bald eagles that are out here as well. That is a tribute to the recovery efforts that we've done on eagles. We don't use DDT anymore, so the nest survival is much higher than it was for a number of years and those sorts of things. So even though we have a much, much smaller sheep industry in Kansas than we do a cattle industry, this is still a significant impact on our producers. And per capita, it's going to be a much greater impact on the sheep producers at about $640,000 annually in Kansas versus $4 million to cattle producers. So how do we do predator control? There's lots of there's a couple of different models. One model is you've already paid taxes, and then you can pay the federal government more, and they'll come out and they'll kill stuff for you. We've actually never had that model in Kansas. The other model is your tax dollars pay an extension wildlife specialist like me, and I'll come out and teach you how to take care of your own problems, and then you can continue to do that year after year after year. And that's an approach that's been very successful in Kansas. It's an education approach, and then we also provide the equipment to help you get that done. So if you're having losses and you need help, please reach out to your local extension office, or my contact info will be up here. You can call me directly. I try to get out to those calls within 24 hours of receiving them. So when I come, we're going to evaluate a bunch of the stuff that we'll talk about later on in this that you can do from a preventative approach. But then I'll also teach you how to use the tools to remove coyotes or whatever your problem predator is. They're fixing to turn some wolves loose not too far from here in Colorado. And I'm expecting some of those wolves are going to end up here. And I've already been talking to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about what we're going to do in the event that that does happen. So that's something that may be on the horizon. But right now, our main issue is coyotes. So I can sure teach you how to deal with those. So when I say it's an integrated approach, we use non-lethal prevention strategies like fencing, dealing with carcasses through composting and those sorts of things. I already said fencing, sorry. Guardian animals is what I meant to say, and then coyote control. If we have other predators that are causing problems, then we'll control them. But like I said, coyotes are the main one that we've got to deal with. So you go out to a pasture, and this is what you see. It's clearly been chewed on by something. But was this a predation event or was this a scavenging event from the animal feeding point of view? What killed that steer? Okay, that's an important thing to think about. Let's look for a lethal wound, a killing bite mark, we might call it. From this picture, I can look at some other things, and we can talk about those here, we can talk about them later, but one of the things that stands out to me is how little blood there is on the ground. How little blood there is on the fur. Another thing that stands out, that foam coming out of his nose. We don't usually see that in a predation event. That's usually an indication of something else. But I get a lot of pictures like this, and some of them I go out and help the producer evaluate. Some of them I can look at over the picture or through the internet, talk over the phone, that sort of thing, and let them know what's going on. So we got to figure out the cause of death. And like that slide said, only about 5% of our losses are actually due to predators in Kansas. So most likely, one of these other mortality causes is the reason that animal is dead. It's not always. Sometimes we do have predation. What did that sheep die from?
I mean, it looks like it struggle marks because it's a circle behind her.
Okay.
You're gonna say. So I mean, I don't see, there's no blood.
Is it grass burn?
No blow.
So that circle,
There's no blow. So probably a poisonous plant, maybe lightning, since it's dark mark.
that circle mark, he asked if it was burnt. And you mentioned lightning. There's also black wool laying around. That was a lightning strike on that animal. So, I don't get to look at very many of those, but they do happen, of course. So there's lots of different things that critters can die from. That's the point. So how do we figure that out? We go through the process that I've been alluding to on this picture. Things that we're going to look at are facts from the carcass remains, bite marks, how much blood's on the fur, has it been consumed, or has it just been wounded and mauled? Wildlife tend to kill because they're hungry. Some of our other predators, especially dogs, tend to kill because they're bored. And so they don't typically consume very much flesh, if any. How much blood is on the soil or the vegetation? What kind of tracks are around? Do we have tracks of animals that are likely to have been predators, or are they tracks that might only be from scavenging? And that's also going to help us identify the predator, right? We can tell the difference if we know what we're looking at between a coyote track and a dog track, or a mountain lion track, or even a wolf track. And so those are things we can look at. Have we seen a lot of coyotes around? Or other predators around? Have we seen young or small livestock disappearing? Just totally disappearing? A lot of people really underestimate how much of a calf a coyote or a family group of coyotes can remove overnight. It's pretty common for them to just totally disappear. We had a whole bunch of GPS collars on deer just a little bit east of here for several years. And it was very rare that even with the mortality switch on a GPS collar that sent us an email saying, hey, deer such and such died, go to this spot and look for it. A lot of times we get there and those carcasses were clean. They can clean them up really, really quick. Unusual livestock behavior, that's another thing. All right, so facts on carcasses. This is a picture somebody sent me. Anything you notice about this calf? Was that a predation event or was that a scavenging event? Why do you say it's a scavenging event?
Doesn't look like a calf ever got up.
It does not look like the calf ever got up. There's several reasons that that's the case. One of them is the posture. The other are these membranes on the hooves. Okay? This is how they look when they come out. Those pretty well look the same. They get scarred up really quick. They change color really quickly. So that's something I'm going to look at. What else?
No blood.
Okay, all the blood's inside the carcass, right? It's not all over the place. Anything about the color of the flesh?
Looks dull.
Okay, it looks,
Looks like it's a cabin. Looks like you died in a cabin and just laid there. That's
sure. The color of the meat, you said pale, it's pink, right? It's not deep red. It doesn't look like trauma to a live animal occurred there. I talked about this one a little bit when we saw it before, but the foam is a big indication that this wasn't a predation event. The amount of blood, there's a lack of blood on the ground. There's some, but there's not a lot. There's some leakage there from the carcass. There's hardly any blood on that white fur. We ought to be seeing lots of blood on that white fur, but I still go ahead and skin that animal out, look at its throat, see if there are any subcutaneous areas of hemorrhaging and that sort of thing that would indicate a lethal wound, around its neck. We didn't find those. This producer was convinced it was a mountain lion. So I went above and beyond and skinned the animal, even though I was pretty sure that that wasn't the case, just to make sure that it wasn't. And what I ended up finding was inside that trachea, there was lots of fluid and some swelling, and I called our vet at K-State, our extension veterinarian, and AJ said, yeah, that was a honker, which doesn't mean anything to me, I'm a wildlife guy, but that's tracheal edema, basically. So when that animal went from grass to feed, the dust irritated its throat, it got the swelling in there, and succumbed to that. If I would have found something that looked like this below the skin in here, that indicates that that animal's heart's still beating when it was bitten. Okay? That's what a really, really bad bruise would look like below your skin. If that animal was still alive, it might look like it was wearing a football helmet or a neck brace or something like that. We'd see a whole bunch of swelling from both edema and from that internal bleeding. We got two different carcasses here. Both were chewed on in the same spot, essentially. I'm looking at the hubs here. I still see some yellow membrane on there, but a lot of that's gone. The color started to change, and the areas where the yellow membrane is sort of scarred up. It's got some rubs on it. So I think this animal was up at one point, but I don't really see anything on that that indicates that it was alive when the coyote ate on it. And there's coyote tracks around it to show that it was coyote. We've got quite pink flesh again on this animal, so it was most likely scavenged. To be 100% sure, I'd have to skin that one out and look. But it was most likely scavenged, and the producer didn't want to trap coyotes anyway. He wanted to make sure it wasn't mountain lion. And we got that taken care of. What about this one? I was talking about that really dark red color. The meat looks like there was trauma to it. This animal was alive when it started getting chewed on back here. There's a lot of blood on that black hair. It had been moved from the spot where it was chewed on, where we'd see lots of blood all over the grass too. So that's what it would look like if it got chewed on by a predator. How much blood's in a carcass? Mike, I got a picture like this, and I don't have any idea why that animal died. There's not enough of it there to tell me if that's all I get to see, right? It's a hide, it's been stretched out, all the good parts have been eaten, but there was a whole lot of blood, an area that looked like there had been a struggle, and multiple pictures that included more areas of blood strung out all over the place. I felt like this one was probably a predation event with the little bit of evidence that I had. This also could have just been several coyotes dragging a dead carcass around and chewing on it. I don't know that for 100%. But this is more like what we're looking for. And if you got snow, of course, you can really see how much blood there can be, and that's a really old, poor picture, but sometimes that's all we got. I had a sheep producer call me and say that he went out to check on his sheep, went out in the pens, and one of the ewes looked like somebody took a red magic marker and drew streaks all over her side. And her lamb was missing. And then he realized that that was blood, not red magic marker. And when you've got a beating heart and good blood pressure, and a coyote perforates this area, that's the kind of blood you're going to see. You're going to see squirts of that stuff. All right, so how do you tell what kind of predator's been chewing on stuff? One of the ways is by the sign that's around, looking at the tracks, scat, and those sorts of things. We can also look at the patterns. We don't have 100% this critter always does this feeding patterns. Just because it's on the back end does not mean it's always a canid. Just because it's up here does not mean it's always a cat. In fact, Coyotes and dogs will oftentimes feed on the rib cage, especially of a very young animal. But if we see lots of mutilation on the legs like this, that tends to be dogs. Especially on a very large animal like this, it's way too big to be coyote prey anyway. Sometimes people see this kind of stuff and think those are claw marks. Those are drag marks from canine teeth on a dog or a coyote if it was an animal that had been chewed on by a coyote. I see lots and lots of marks like that are caused by dogs. Sometimes dogs will stretch them out and get them killed. Of course, we can see that there was active bleeding on this animal, and very likely that, or not very likely, the dogs killed this animal in that event. We can also see some pretty bad mutilation of faces of young livestock. Coyotes will also do this, but when we've got animals that are still alive, especially smaller animals that are still alive that have had that sort of chewing on them, it's typically a dog. Remember, dogs kill because they're bored. Coyotes kill because they're hungry. That dog was over by Norton. And that's what it looks like when the predator switch flips in a German Shepherd's brain, when they've been playing. I get lots of pictures like this of bottle calves. It's an unfortunate thing that happens sometimes when dogs get too excited, especially if you've got a dog that's got a little bit of aggressive tendencies. A lot of times people think these are mountain lions because they're so gruesome. That calf would not still be alive, and there would be much more consumed had it been killed by a mountain lion. Mountain lions bite here, crush the back of the skull, which basically results in an immediate kill, or they grab here and strangle very quickly. Wildlife tend not to feed on animals that are still alive most of the time. It's not a 100% rule, but most of the time. We can see really bad mutilation on the back end of animals. And again, we've got multiple animals that are mutilated in a relatively similar way, and very little flesh has been consumed on these animals. It wasn't done out of hunger, it was done out of boredom. You see this pig was killed, lots of wounds up on the head, a little bit of chewing on the side. Had a call a couple years ago, 30 piglets dead from the neighbor's Pyrenees. You know, that sort of stuff happens more than you think it would. Okay, what about coyotes? And this one's not, you can't see any definitive thing in this picture that says it was a coyote for sure. She may have died while she was giving birth, right? But we do see on a fairly, not a lot of cows die like this, but when a cow gets down and she's in a place where there's a lot of coyotes, this can happen, right? And if that did happen, how much blood's inside a cow? About 8 gallons, right? So if she died from birth, you're probably not going to see a ton of that blood around the carcass. If a coyote started chewing on her while she was still alive and giving birth, you're going to see a whole heck of a lot of blood outside that carcass. A lot more than you probably would expect to. Of course, during that same scenario, sometimes coyotes get a hold of a calf's tail, and the calf makes it. That calf was lucky. This one over here wasn't quite so lucky. The difference between this and a dog is a fair bit of flesh has been consumed from this animal, whereas it was mostly just mutilation on the dogs. And of course, on smaller ruminants, this is one I was working with the goat producer, but it shows those 2 canine punctures. There's 2 on the other side. That's where they like to grab them. This was a quite big doe, and that's why they weren't able to get her killed. She ended up dying anyway. This is a very common way that coyotes will grab a hold of sheep. They like to get a hold of that jaw. Sometimes you'll even see puncture marks in that side of that mandible from where they've gotten a hold of They get a hold of them by the jaw, they'll also grab them by the shoulder, get them down. And then again, if we skin that back, we see either pooling blood or what would look like bruising underneath the skin if it's an older carcass. And you do have to be careful with that, because like on that steer that I skinned back, you could see that there was some dark areas in there. Decomposition does that too. So you're really looking for blood, not just darker meat when you skin them back like that. All right, y'all experts on telling the difference between dogs and coyotes now? Okay.
Well, a coyote grab a hold of a calf's nose.
It will, yeah. A coyote will grab a hold of a calf's nose and sometimes chew off part of that snout, like we saw on the one done by the dog. Typically, that's a case where the calf got away from the coyote, whereas when the dog quits, it's probably because he's bored.
Well, I noticed we lost a calf once, and it had a puncture wounds in its nose, and the nose kind of ripped open a little bit. Put a trap on it and caught it like a couple hours later, but
Yeah,
I figured that's what it was. It was just a coyote killed it.
it sure can be. Were there any wounds elsewhere on the calf?
Started eating on it. but-
On the back end? Yeah. So, I mean, to know for sure, you'd have to see, you'd have to look for some of those other things that I was pointing out. But that's the process you go through. This is one thing that a lot of people underestimate. Dealing with dead livestock, getting them away from where you're calving. These are coyotes that I had GPS collars on over by Manhattan. What do you suppose these points, each color is a different coyote. So we got these points where lots of colors come together in the same spots on the landscape. Any idea what those spots might be?
Dead pin.
That's a dead pit. That's a buffalo. There was a cow right here that was dead. So those are very important resources for coyotes. So much so, this was a younger female coyote that I caught and collared. She had a really tight home range right in here from April until about October, excluding some visits over to that same dead buffalo right here. And one of the things that's important to note is, long after there's nothing left to eat there, she's still going back and checking on it. Several months later, it's a pile of bones, everything consumable's gone, but they still go back and they check on those spots. Several trips down to the dead pit, and then in like late October, she takes off and she goes up east of Manhattan. There's a smaller feed yard up there where she's at, kind of a place where somebody might winter their cattle, not a big feed operation. Then she comes back down to Konza. That was either a 4-day or a 6-day trip. I don't remember exactly how long it was. It was 4 to 6 days. And then she comes back, she checks on that dead buffalo again. She comes over here, there's a new dead buffalo right there. She goes even farther down to where there's another dead pit on a different neighbor. Comes back to this new dead buffalo, and overnight she makes this trip. That's 9 miles. What do you suppose is down here?
Dead animal.
Flint Hills feeders. They've got a dead pile, and right there was a dead cow that a rancher shot her on. So, those carcasses are incredibly important resources to coyotes on the landscape. And if you're calving around carcasses, if you're calving close to a dead pile, if you're leaving dead animals out there in the pasture, you're asking for problems. This is a video that a friend of mine from Ulysses sent me last year, his thermal scope. All those things moving around are coyotes. That's a dead cow that got killed while she was giving birth. Yeah, a couple of skunks. I think the most I counted, this is a pretty long video, I'm not showing you the whole thing, but the most I counted, I think there was 13 feeding on her at once. And they're not all local coyotes, right? They're coming in from a long ways away. Just something interesting in this video. The blacker something is, the hotter it is. So you can see the faces on a lot of these coyotes. Why is that one over there all black?
else that killed it?
He's mangy. He doesn't have any hair. So he looks really hot. That's just an interesting thing to see when you do that stuff. But that's just to kind of reinforce how many coyotes get drawn into that stuff.
So what's your recommendation from how far your dead pit should be if you're not gonna decompose throughout your cabin area? Like,
If you're not gonna cover it up, I'd wanna be 10 miles from it,
okay,
if you could. I mean, that's not possible for a lot of people.
right,
So then I'd say cover it up.
do a decompose.
Yeah, compost them, or even, have them picked up and hauled off.
That don't work.
That doesn't work?
You can't get that done out here.
Sure. In some places, it's not possible, and that's where composting can be really, really important. I was just at a place a couple weeks ago down at Johnson, as a backgrounding operation, and, he's got a compost pit, but he doesn't cover it all that frequently. Yeah.
So what's the minimum amount of soil cover that you wanna have on top? Something that they won't dig through.
So the place I was at, he's burying in the ground and putting some manure and stuff in there and composting in the ground, whereas, sometimes you might compost on a concrete pad. Especially sheep producers and goat producers might do that. But that operation I was at, he was getting about 3 feet of dirt over them, and they were trying to dig into it, but they weren't getting down to the carcasses. But he also had 7 or 8 carcasses hanging out all the time that the coyotes were still chewing on. And they weren't bothering his dairy cows, but they killed 150 or 200 chickens last year. And so I was trying to help him get that issue under control. But yeah, for most people, just burying is the most practical solution for dealing with those dead animals. But even if you can't move your dead pile, move as far from it to where you're gonna calve. I think is the big thing. And if you do have a cow die, keep grabbing that, get her out of the pasture. Something they do a lot in wolf country that probably seems silly to most of us here is use something called flaggery. It's just plastic flagging hung from an electric fence wire. Most wild dogs, and I'm talking about wolves, coyotes, foxes, are spooky. They don't like new things, and they especially don't like new things that flap around in the wind and that sort of thing. So this is something that for several weeks you can keep, and up to 2 months as we're thinking about wolves, you can keep them off of a carcass with this stuff. It's much, much more effective if you use what they call turbo flaggery, and that's where that wire is electrified so that it's not just scary. When they do try to cross it, it bites them, right? This isn't an end-all be-all, but it's one part of a management program. Let's say where you are calving, you don't have a choice where else to go. This might be something you could do around the boundary of where you're calving to reduce the coyote activity. We don't do this here. They're starting to do it, and they, meaning cattle producers, are starting to do it in wolf country. It's becoming more of a used option where they're dealing with those bigger predators. And one of the big challenges with wolves is they'll do what we call surplus killing. They'll kill a lot more than they're gonna eat. You might go out and you've got 20 dead steers in the pen, or something like that overnight. Whereas we don't see that kind of stuff in coyotes. Exclusion. Coyotes are a lot more athletic than a lot of people realize they are. If you're gonna try and exclude them, you gotta get high enough, and a woven wire fence down that low is not probably gonna do you much good. But that's just a neat picture that somebody got that I like to show. Most cattle producers aren't gonna go to these extremes. This is more for sheep folks and goat folks. But if you are thinking about trying to exclude coyotes from animals, you wanna use woven wire. You don't wanna use this stuff that's got gaps this wide and this tall. I know it's cheaper, but that's not a coyote fence. Coyotes go right through those big squares. So you're looking for 4 by 6 squares. and at least 5.5 feet high. It's better if you've got a barbed wire on top of that, or an electrified wire. And if you really need to keep them out, you can put what's called a coyote roller on there, which is a piece of fence that goes out away from the fence, so the coyote would actually have to do the limbo to climb up over the top of it. And they're not gonna do that. Some poultry producers and a few sheep and goat producers will put a buried apron underneath that fence too, to keep them from digging under. But again, this is not typically what most cattle producers are thinking about.
Sheep are a lot of work.
Yeah, they are, and an unfortunate thing that I'm seeing is we've got a lot of folks who were cattle producers that are trying to be sheep producers, and they're trying to raise sheep the same way they raise cattle. And they have incredible losses, because they're not protecting their animals from the predators the way that sheep need to be, that's different from coyotes. I do show up at places sometimes, and this is the kind of fence we got around the sheep. And when we try to set traps outside of that to catch the coyotes, where we're not exposing sheep to traps, we catch the sheep outside the fence too. So if it's not gonna keep the sheep in, it's definitely not gonna keep the coyotes out. And if somebody's looking for a cheaper option, you can take that poly wire and get your wires a whole lot closer together toward the bottom, like they are here, and then they can get wider at the top. And in that situation, you want to alternate ground and hot wires. You don't want to try and count on the ground to ground that coyote out. You want him to touch 2 wires and get a pop no matter what, unless you just have way too much vegetation going through there. But you can use some cheaper materials, and then that poly mesh stuff that they're making now works pretty good. Again, we don't have a lot of folks in Kansas that are using guard dogs with their cattle, but in wolf country, it's a staple for a lot of people. I hope that we don't ever become wolf country, and I'm gonna do my best to make sure that we don't. But if we do have to start dealing with some bigger predators, then this may be something that cattle producers might need to start thinking about. Thinking about the effectiveness of guard dogs, there's several different studies that have looked at different aspects of their effectiveness. One study reported that they were second only to shed lambing at reducing predation. Another showed that loss prevention can vary anywhere from 11% to 100%. So they can be really effective, or they can be almost not effective at all. What about cost effectiveness? There was a study in California where they had 500 breeding ewes, and they saw that they reduced lamb losses by 43% and ewe losses by 25% for $16,000 in averted losses during the 7-year useful lifespan of the dog. But the cost of the dogs and their care exceeded that $16,000 by $13,400 over that 7-year useful life period. So whether or not guard dogs are gonna make sense for your operation is gonna depend on a lot of specific things about your operation. Of course, we've got other guardian animals too. There's llamas. As a wildlife specialist, I like dogs when they're good. I tend to like the ruminant guardian animals more when dogs are not effective, because I don't have to worry about trapping a llama. I don't have to worry about trapping a donkey. But if you got a guard dog out there, then we are probably going to catch it if we're trying to trap coyotes in the pen. Now, it's not going to do any damage to that dog if you're checking traps every day like you're supposed to. But depending on the disposition of your dog, it may not be very easy to get it out of the trap. So that is something that a lot of people are concerned about. Another advantage that the ruminants can have is faster results. They don't have to be trained. They're already spooky about coyotes and that sort of thing. They're gonna hang out with the sheep. Potential 20-year useful life rather than 7. Fewer special management considerations. We don't have to feed them, right? They're eating the same stuff as the sheep and goats are gonna eat. And then I mentioned the compatibility. Donkeys, if you got a good one, the donkey's gonna do that, or kick them in the head, something similar. But there's a lot of donkeys that kill as many sheep or more as the coyotes do, because they can be really aggressive. So it's a case-by-case basis with them. So that's all the preventative stuff. Most of that stuff takes a fair bit of time to implement. So those are longer-term solutions. The short-term solution is getting rid of the animals that are causing the problem. Because most coyotes aren't killing livestock. It's typically a very, very small percentage of the population, and I'll show you in a few minutes that it may only be one individual. But our options for lethal control are foothold traps, snares, calling and shooting, denning, and just shooting too. I mean, if you got a gun in your pickup, you don't have to call them in, right? Hunting with dogs, and in some other states, we've got aerial hunting, M44s, which are sodium cyanide devices, and then livestock protection collars, which use a chemical called compound 1080. These options are not legal in Kansas. We haven't had sodium cyanide since 1992. So those aren't options here. And the reality is, if you can get a coyote to bite on a cyanide delivery gun that's sitting down on the ground and yank on it and get a mouthful of cyanide, I can definitely get you to get one to step in a trap. And we can turn anything loose that we want to turn loose out of that trap. Once something's got sodium cyanide in their mouth, they're dead. It doesn't matter whether it's a kid, your dog, a coyote, a badger, a deer, whatever gets it in their mouth dies. Okay, so our goal is not population reduction. That doesn't work very well with coyotes for a number of reasons that we'll talk about. Our goal is to remove the problem critters. It's typically going to be alpha pairs that are responsible. And usually, it's during time periods when they've got pups on the ground, because that's when they need the larger food sources the most. Targeted removal is less expensive than trying to do a predator reduction program. It also has a very low impact to non-target species. Again, we can turn loose most of the things we catch in foothold traps. Snares, not so much, but I can avoid catching most of the non-targets that I don't want to catch in a snare by how I place it. So, targeted removal is the most common approach used today. Why not population control? Well, coyote abundance tends to be controlled by food availability. And when we go in and wipe out a whole bunch of coyotes, what happens to the food availability? It may not immediately go up, but it tends to go back up relatively quickly. It's also mediated by social dominance and territoriality. So for every coyote you remove, there's one waiting to fill its spot. About half the coyotes in most populations are residents and have a home range, and about half are transients, and they're floating around waiting for somebody to die. And because of that stuff, models indicate that you have to kill more than 70% of the population every year to even come close to eliminating it. That's about the same numbers that we get for feral hogs. And because of that dynamic between food availability and abundance that can result in increased litter sizes and females that don't normally breeding after a big predator control program, they typically return to previous densities within 3 years. And by that I mean when USDA goes in our western sheep raising rangelands and try and wipe out counties worth of coyotes, right? We're using sodium cyanide, we're using aerial gunning, and we're killing a whole bunch of coyotes. Within 3 years, they've rebounded. So it's much better to try and target the problem coyotes. So how effective is selective removal? Well, the studies that have tried to look at how many coyotes we have to remove before problems stop show no relationship between the number of coyotes removed and our problem stopping. Okay? What we have to do is get rid of those dominant breeding coyotes whose territories overlap the sheep pastures or our calving areas, because they're the ones that are responsible for most of the predation. In one study that was looking at this, one male was responsible for 71% of the kills. So our goal is selective removal of one or both of that alpha pair, because that's what's going to stop the problem. So how do we do targeted removal? Snares are a very good tool if you've got the right kind of fencing and you can catch them coming in and out of the area where you're having losses. You know you're catching the coyotes that are coming in and out. Snares are also working all the time, and they're pretty efficient. We also have trapping with foothold traps. These are the two main things that we're going to do along with calling and shooting coyotes. And again, calling and shooting is as selective as it can be, right? You're making a decision about whether or not to pull the trigger on each individual animal. We're at our 8 o'clock, so I'm gonna go through the rest of this stuff pretty quick. But when you're thinking about trapping or snaring, location is key. If you're not in the places where the coyotes are at, you're not gonna catch coyotes. So we're gonna do a couple of different things to make sure we're in places where there are coyotes. One is go look for sign in areas where coyotes are likely to be. Coyotes are kind of lazy. They run on trails that we make, they run on trails that cattle make, and they run on trails where other critters have walked because those are the easiest places to get around. If you've got a low area or a dip in a hill, in Flint Hills we call them saddles, that people that live in mountains would probably laugh at that. But that's where coyotes are gonna come over. So if you've got that combined with the road, that's a good spot to look for tracks. I always look at an aerial image. I'm looking for long, linear areas of cover, transition zones between different cover types. So we're going from pasture to a crop field. I like corners, because if the coyote's coming this way, I can catch him here. If the coyote's coming that way, I can catch him there. I've got 2 sets there. If the pair's running together, I'm probably gonna catch both of them. I always look at pond dams. We don't have a lot of those out here. But pond dams almost always have coyote sign on them. Gate entrances, so there's probably some coyote sign right there. Areas along the creek, and especially where we've got a whole bunch of stuff coming together. Those are all spots I would look for sign. And just because it should be a good spot, if there's not sign there, it's probably not the best place to set a trap. Sign can be tracks, it can be scat, they can both look like a lot of different things. If you're gonna send your wildlife specialist a picture of something, whether it's a calf that's been chewed on, whether it's a track, whether it's poop or whatever, put something in there of known size for scale. Because it's easy to know those are coyote tracks, it's not so easy to know that one is. That could be a swift fox, right? It might be this big. Alright, so I'm going to skip over the part about how to trap. We don't just set traps on the ground, we typically dig a hole, bed a trap under the soil in front of that hole, put some attractors down into it. If we're snaring, it's important to remember that just because they're supposed to be lethal, you can't just put them out there and let them work. You still have to check them every day, just like you do traps. You can set them in trails, you can set them in crawl unders, especially if you got woven wire fence. Calling, so we're going to call into cover, typically calling either into the wind or across the wind. We don't want our wind blowing our scent toward the coyotes, just like we wouldn't want it if we were deer hunting. And, you know, there's lots and lots and lots of calls out there. This time of year, I'm using a lot of prey distress sounds, and then going into more aggressive stuff. The prey distress sounds, of course, get their hunger response. The coyote distress sounds are more of a responding to help another family member that might be getting their butt whipped, or to come join in, or just for entertainment. And then vocalizations attract them for lots of different reasons. But I usually start with prey, then go into coyote distress, some vocalizations and stuff like that when I'm calling. The thermal imagery is kind of a new thing, and one of the questions I get from a lot of producers is it safe? Well, that's what it looks like when you're looking at coyotes at about 100 yards coming in with the thermal. You can see the sky, you can see the cedar trees, you can see the plum thickets out there. I can see cattle that are 1.5 miles away with my thermal. They don't look like cattle, they look like big rocks, but they're clumped up such that I can tell what they are. I'm probably less likely to shoot something behind what I'm aiming at with this than I would be during the day, because you can just see so much of the landscape. The other thing is, it gives us a lot of room for error. A lot of times when I'm calling at night, I'm standing like this in a wide open field. If it's good and dark, if there's not a moon, I'm not going to get cover. I'm going to stand out in the wide open where I can see as much area as I can. I took this young man last spring. That was the 3rd coyote I called in for him that night. It was the first one he got, and he shot at it 3 times. I called it back in 3 different times to give him opportunities to shoot it. And And finally he got it, and he was nervous, you know, I mean, that's an exciting deal when you got predators coming in like that, it gets your heart going. So I went through that last part pretty quick, but any questions?
Do the stress ones work better when there's pups in the springtime?
So the pup distress sounds, and then some of the more aggressive fighting type vocalizations and that kind of stuff work really, really good. I mean, pup distress works year round. It's just something that gets a natural response from an adult coyote. I don't ever start with it this time of the year though, because about half the coyotes you're calling at right now are pups, and they don't want to get in a fight. And so I'm typically starting with like a rabbit distress type sound right now, and then from really February, sometimes middle of January on, I'm going to do a lot of howling, and I'm going to do a lot of pup distress and a lot of really aggressive fighting sounds. And during the summertime, I do all of it.
If you do find a wolf on your property,
Uh-huh.
what are we allowed to do from a predator control standpoint?
First thing you need to do is call me, and then we will develop a plan.
Okay.
If there is a wolf on your property, we can't do anything.
Okay.
Just presence is not damage. And the same thing's true with a mountain lion. If a mountain lion is on your property, we can't do anything. If property damage occurs, now we've got a state statute that allows us to do things. The challenge with wolves is, depending on what population it's from, it may be protected under the Threatened and Endangered Species Act, which means that all we can do is scare it off. Or bring the Fish and Wildlife Service in and have them help us relocate it. My understanding is that this new population in Colorado is designated as an experimental population, and so if there are livestock losses, those animals can be removed. But that needs to be on a case-by-case basis determined. The challenge is, when you look at that wolf out there, you don't know if it came from Michigan or if it came from Colorado. And we had a wolf killed at Waukene in 2012 and one killed in Barber County in 2017, and both those animals were Great Lakes wolves. They were not from the Rockies population. So it's touchy.
Okay,
But,
are they tagged here, marked?
the ones from Colorado will be tagged. The other ones were not. They were genetically linked back to those populations. That's the best answer I can give you right now. Call me and I will be at your place real fast.
Do you expect that to be a problem in the future?
I don't expect it to be a frequent problem. I do, if this population gets established in Colorado, we're gonna have some wolves in Kansas, more wolves than we have had. What we will most likely have though are dispersers, like we have with the mountain lions, that are just moving across the state. And those younger animals tend not to fool with livestock. The mountain lions that we have come through, we have not had a documented case that was confirmed by somebody who knew what they were talking about, that one killed livestock in modern times. They are mostly eating raccoons and porcupines and possums and stuff like that. They're not even killing very many deer. I expect that the wolves that we'll get will mostly be those kind of individuals.
So you're talking younger ones that get shoved out of their territory by
Exactly.
the alpha or whatever?
Yeah,
Just moving through to the next place?
yeah,
Will they typically follow, like we'll get elk move through here,
right.
will they follow that same pattern, will they follow the elk, that trail, that they leave?
It's really hard. They're probably not gonna follow the elk's trail all the time. And the elk that we get moving through here, I don't know that, they're probably not coming from the Rocky Mountains. We've got elk in western Kansas strung from Syracuse all the way over to Hayes part of the time. So I don't think that the elk are coming from the Rockies and that the wolves are gonna follow them that way. But they may be likely to follow the same drainages and that sort of thing. because they probably are gonna follow drainages as they're moving across the landscape.
Coyote pellets are not good price.
They're not right now, no.
Rabbit population is down.
Mm-hmm.
You expect more coyote problems in the near future?
I thought we were gonna have a bunch during the drought, and I didn't get hardly any calls during the drought. I started to get more calls here recently. I mean, there's not a strong cycle between rabbits and coyotes like there is for lynx and hares in the Arctic and that sort of thing. But it tends to be that when there's a lot of rabbits, then coyotes get really abundant, and then the rabbits tend to decline, and then the coyotes get mange and get hungry and those sorts of things and start to decline. And you can have more problems when they're hungrier. You would expect to have more problems when
Is
they're hungry.
mange an annual problem with coyote population?
It-
Or
It's density dependent. So when coyote populations are average or low, we tend not to see all that much mange in them. But when we have lots of coyotes, then mange ends up spreading through them much more quickly. And some of them die off from it.
seems like we see mangy coyotes every couple of years for sure.
Yeah, and when I was doing a lot of fur trapping, most of the coyotes I kill, I don't actually put a bullet in anymore. I'm going to somebody's place, I'm teaching them how to trap, I'm leaving them with the traps, and then they're checking them, and I see pictures of them. But I'm not the one inspecting them, so I'm not as in tune to that, how much mange there is now as I used to be. But when I was doing a lot of fur trapping, a normal year was about 10%. I'd have to throw away about 10% of my coyote pelts. In a heavy mange year, I might throw away 50%.
We've had coyotes that, in the wintertime, you kick them out between the bale rows, and they got, they're black.
Yeah,
They got almost no hair
sure.
at all.
Yeah, and they'll get under houses, they'll do all kinds of stuff when they're cold like that. We do have a new podcast. I don't know if y'all get bored and listen to podcasts when you're driving around, but I do an episode every 2 weeks, and then our pond specialist does an episode every 2 weeks. So it's a wildlife damage topic 1 week, and then 2 weeks later there's a pond topic. So if you get really bored, it's something for you to listen to.
Is it on the radio?
It is, so the radio, every other Monday, well, it's every fourth Monday now, I do a 5-minute radio segment on Ag Today. Joe does a 5-minute segment, our pond specialist does a 5-minute segment on an alternate every fourth Monday, and then every other Tuesday would be a condensed version of each of our podcast episodes. So yesterday was a podcast episode about some wildlife damage stuff that got condensed on Ag Today to an 11-minute segment. So it is on the radio, sorry, that's a long-winded way of saying yes. But
I know, I used to hear Charlie Lea he was on KSRE, but I don't hear him anymore, but somebody else took it over.
that's me.
That's you?
Yeah.
So I guess I haven't heard you for a while.
Anything else? Okay.